After giving all her comrades the order to go and level up for 3 months, Jishuka immediately went to the shop to replenish her arrows. While waiting for her order, Jishuka noticed in her peripheral vision the members of other guilds who were very numerous, and mentally said, "Our guild's situation is quite difficult. We could attract people at the very beginning of the game, but now we can't do it." Looking through the slots in the store, the girl mentally said, "We need to buy at least some arrows." And suddenly she saw something strange, a purple arrow. Looking at Jishuka's offerings, she wondered in her head what kind of idiot he was, selling them for 3 times the price of ordinary arrows for silver. Suddenly, she noticed something strange about the arrows that cost 3 times as much. Noticing a high-quality arrow for the price of silver arrows, she was surprised to say that the purple one was of epic class. Looking at the description of the arrow, which said, "Special Jaffa Arrow Quality Epic Attack Power Weight," ignores some of the enemy's defenses. There is a chance of completely ignoring the enemy's defense. Looking at this arrow, Jishuka said in her head, it was simply impossible. Leaning on the counter in surprise at the availability of such a product, she mentally said, "I've asked almost every blacksmith to make me arrows, but no, I've never actually heard of arrows of such high quality." Immediately after paying attention to the additional characteristics, Jishuka added in her mind, moreover, this ability, they can be a decisive weapon in a high-level battle. I can bet on them, but who could make such arrows at all? Immediately after that, the girl began to think about where the goods of such quality could come from, and mentally said it was not the top-ranked blacksmiths Pan Mir and Stang. At the same time, Regus, sitting at the table with his friend, grabbed his head and said in confusion, "I'm in trouble. How can I raise 20 levels in 3 months?" To which Wantner replied, "Take it seriously. You already know Jishuka personally, so if she said she would finish us off, I'm sure she wasn't kidding." Immediately after that, the warrior picked up a ham and handed it to Regus and said, "I'm ready to pay for the last piece of meat in your life. Now tell me." And when Regus heard that, Mr. Vantner replied with a grudging smile. Before they had time to indulge, an urgent message came to all members of the guild, and when Vantner noticed it, he was surprised to hear an announcement from the head of the guild. The message said, "Find a person among the top blacksmiths whose player level is lower than the skill level." After reading it, he was surprised to hear that she was telling us to look for blacksmiths. Hearing about the new order, Rega exclaimed in displeasure and jumped up from his seat. But she said to level up, "Don't you think she's being too frivolous?" The next moment, when another message came from Jishuka, Regus took his soft rabbit toy and said gently, "We have a good boy here." Regus saw the behavior of his friend Wantner and asked in surprise, "Have you seen the message yet?" He said, "I see that there is no trace of your anger left." The next moment, another message came from the head of the guild, to whom she wrote, "This player has a skill that will lead us to victory over the Forest Guardian." Seeing this, Vantner stood up and said confidently, "If she's so sure, we need to find the boy." Gathering her comrades in one place, Jishuka walked towards them, saying in her head, "Our small team of elite players managed to reach the top of every class in just 6 months. But feeling our superiority, we are no longer accepting new members." Preparing to search for the famous blacksmith, the girl looked at her team of strong players and said in her head, "We may not be as famous and influential as other guilds, but we have been noticed, and now we have concentrated power in our hands." Moving confidently forward, the head of the guild continued her thoughts. "We are the Sadaka Guild." Recalling the epic arrow she had accidentally found in the market, she added in her mind that if he was better than Panmir and Steng, then his level of craftsmanship and performance was beyond imagination. With an overwhelming desire to find the one blacksmith who can lead their guild to the ranks of the best, she confidently said in her head, "Guilds from all over the continent will plunge into chaos looking for him. We must find him before they do." Sometime after the first information about that legendary blacksmith spread around the world somewhere in a cave, a man asked his friend what is seriously possible. You have already heard the rumors. While excavating to get materials for crafting items, the miner stopped working and said that a strong guild was looking for that blacksmith everywhere. He must have done something cool. Looking at his friend who was just doing something on the internet, the miner shouted to him, "All Satisfy is talking about him. Are you listening to me, Panmir?" After looking through all the news to find out what exactly that famous blacksmith everyone was talking about had done to Panmir, who was the top blacksmith in the game, I said thoughtfully, I had just seen the news. An epic arrow means. Looking at the news page, which said a special Jaffa arrow created by a master craftsman with a high level of skill and production, Panmir mentally said, created by a master craftsman with a high level of skill and productivity, but with a lack of experience and reputation, that's what it says. Even I'm not called a master craftsman in the descriptions. Thinking about what could be happening right now, Panmir added in his head, although this has happened twice before, I was the first to create an epic level item. I was very happy because I put in more effort than anyone else, but still. At the same time, Grid, who did not even suspect that such a hunt would begin for him just because of the epic level arrows, was waiting for his turn and mentally said when the labor exchange would open. After a while at the labor exchange, the manager told the potential staff workers to be careful when you arrive at the place. Now I will start to individually list them. Gathering all the job seekers in front of him, the manager said the construction site of the Shinwoo building needs 4 workers. Holding his hand out to Grid, I wanted to say something, but before he could finish, one of the men pushed him away and said, "Here," and then walked forward to the hiring manager. Looking at the back of the impudent man who had prevented him from getting the job, Grid said that he should have let the unfortunate youth through for his insolence. Having closed the matter with Shinwoo's construction site, the manager said, "Moving on, I need 3 experienced tilers." Reaching out again to nominate a candidate, Grid was slapped in the face because he was again beaten to the punch by a man who had knocked him out of the way. Angry that he was being treated like this for the umpteenth time, Grid shouted out, "What the hell? I want to make money too. Stop acting like this. Why do old men like you act like this?" Hearing the commotion outside the labor exchange office, the manager sighed heavily and said, "Let's keep it down. We don't have time for fights," and handed an electric cable to each employee. Hearing the manager's next suggestion, Grid nervously thought, "Since when has this become so popular? I tried this last year and my medical bills exceeded my income. Thanks, I'll pass." The next moment, Grid felt his arm rise spontaneously, and it was one of the men who had done so on purpose to take out a competitor and send him to hard labor. Grabbing the man by the skin of his teeth, the power line worker pulled Grid along, saying, "Come on, we have a lot of work to do," while Grid angrily shouted, "Hey, you bastards!" But everyone tried to ignore him. Returning home after the labor exchange, Grid said in a tired voice, "I have to go now." Hearing these words from her son, Grid's mother angrily said, "Where are you going so early? At least finish your breakfast." To which the boy replied that he was going to the labor exchange. Hearing that he had to go to the labor exchange to look for a job, Grid's father said to his son, "Wait a little longer, sit with us." As Grid approached the table and pulled out a chair to sit down, he said in his head, "I'm in a hurry. What does he want from me? If I pay the interest on the loan, I'll only have this much left." Holding out a certain amount of money to his son, Grid's father confidently said, "We'll give you the money for the day's earnings, so you better rest today." Hearing this, Grid happily said to his father. Counting the amount of money he had been given, Grid said disappointedly, "Only 70,001. A day's wages now is at least 1,000. Hearing these words from his brother, his younger sister nervously remarked, "God, be grateful for what you are given." The next moment, handing Grid the bath pass, the younger sister added awkwardly, "And don't forget this, we have prepared a bath for you, so you can relax a little." Looking at his parents and sister gathered around the table in the morning, Grid thought in his head, "I wondered if he usually goes to work early in the morning to the grocery store, if my dad was waiting for me to have breakfast." Realizing that everyone was here now only because of him, Grid shone with happiness and said in his head, "You are the best family I have," and then immediately added, "Maybe you can pay off my debt too." As soon as he said this, a bowl of rice flew into Grid's head, as it was too impudent to ask him to pay off his loan for the game capsule. Sometime after he had breakfast with the whole family, Grid went to his capsule to enter the game, and after a while he had already loaded and was in the square. Raising his head after downloading the game, Grid said disappointedly to connect the download and play, "Of course, it is quite cool, but after paying off the debt, my savings account is at 0. Walking through the city, Grid thoughtfully said, "I wonder how high the price of arrows has risen. It's my only money. I need to get to another village as soon as possible." Opening the auction for his arrows, Grid exclaimed nervously when he saw what had happened during his absence from the game. When he saw the system notification that said the winning silver arrow bid was completed and the sale was over, he exclaimed in shock that this was epic, but that the bid was so different from the original price of 6 silver coins. Immediately afterwards, while counting his profits for the sale of the arrows, Grid mentally said 72 silver for the arrow, which would be gold and silver since it was gold. So it turns out that I made a fortune in just 6 hours. Quickly arriving at the auction shop where he left his goods for sale, Grid happily thought, "Now I don't have to go to the labor exchange," and then shouted to the seller, "Bring my money here, my money, my gold coin." Hearing the boy's request, the seller said, "Here's your gold and silver, and there's a commission on epic items." Hearing this, Grid immediately became quiet and stood a little impressed, and when he came to his senses, he grabbed the bag of money and exclaimed, "You're damn capitalists." Immediately after these words, Grid moved away from the shop where he had sold his arrows and said thoughtfully, "If I can make money by creating things, then I don't have to go, right?" Immediately after these thoughts, Grid remembered Smith, who, blushing awkwardly, offered to live together and nervously said, No, this idea is too dangerous here. We need to get out of here." Having paid the carriage driver a considerable sum of money to get to another village, Grid exclaimed in displeasure that the fee was too expensive, and the driver replied, "Thank me at least for giving you a discount. Do you really think driving a carriage is that easy?" Immediately afterwards, Grid remembered the name of the village and said, "By the way, you said the village for beginners is called Winston, yes?" Hearing the question from his passenger, the carriage driver thoughtfully replied that due to the high population growth, it would soon receive the status of a city, and perhaps the heir to the Stame family would become the new mayor of this city. Hearing the name of the family that runs the village, Grid said thoughtfully, "Interesting. It's a familiar name, as if I've heard it somewhere before." After some time of traveling, the driver happily announced, pointing to the path that led forward, "We are almost there. You can see it in the distance." When I heard that they were almost there and the walls of the village of Winston Grid were visible on the horizon, I thought to myself, "Finally, I've almost reached the place I need." Looking at the village he had arrived at, Grid said happily, "Wow. It's 4 times bigger than Byron was, and the streets are much busier than they were back there." Immediately after these words, Grid decided to take off his armor and said confidently, "Let's start our journey from here. It's hard to walk with such a burden. Let's clean up our inventory first." Looking through his inventory, which included potions, weapons, and Jaffa wool, Grid thoughtfully said, "I need to put all my stuff in the warehouse, and where is it? Is this all I have?" After sorting the items, Grid said thoughtfully, "I also need to evaluate Mengel's armor and Mammon's sword. If my skill with weapons and armor goes up, the penalty will be less, right?" After applying his learning skill to the items, Grid saw a system notification that said, "Your skill with the 2-handed sword of Mammon has reached your skill with the armor of Mengele has reached." Then Grid said thoughtfully, "Interestingly, unlike the axe, the skill did not reach immediately." The next moment, the boy received new system notifications informing him that, due to the improvement of the skill, the penalties were reduced. Mammon's two-handed sword was changed from attack power reduction to the Mengel's armor was changed from resistance reduction to 2. Seeing that his equipment was now a little more powerful, Grid happily said, "Great, at least that's a pretty good improvement." The next moment, looking at his armor stats, Grid said thoughtfully, "The durability has decreased so I can increase my understanding by repairing items, but right now I need to save money." Arriving at the vault building, Grid confidently said in his head, "Now I need to get as much money and experience as possible from the institution I will probably get my equipment," and then said, "Please open my vault." Hearing the request of a visitor who wanted to leave his belongings in the vault, the employee said it would cost you 10 silver coins for each item, and hearing the price, Grid said irritatedly, "Money, money, and money again." Agreeing to this deal with the storage worker, Grid said, "Okay, let's do it this way. But first, I'll put my weapons and armor in there." Leaving only one Jaffa arrow with him, Grid thoughtfully said, "I'll probably keep this arrow as a souvenir. I don't really want to spend 10 silver coins on it." Having moved all his belongings into the vault, Grid happily said, "Finally, I am as light as a feather, so now I can find a smithy." Leaving the vault where he left his belongings for storage, Grid said thoughtfully, noticing the players walking around judging by their equipment, "This is a zone for beginners." Then moving a little further, the guy noticed the more powerful players and added, "And here the levels are different for everyone. This is a zone for all levels. I think the forge should be somewhere nearby." Arriving at the place he needed, Grid said excitedly, standing in front of the door, "Wow, it's so big, it looks like a local blacksmith of an improved class or even higher." Confidently heading inside, Grid happily said, "This is exactly what I need." As soon as he stepped into the forge, a system notification appeared in front of him, informing him of the blacksmith's technique, the master effect of the NPC, and that blacksmiths of advanced level and above would treat you well. Upon entering the room, Grid noticed that there was no one there and that everything was in disarray, so he was surprised to hear that it was empty. But where was everything? Walking a little further inside the building, Grid heard someone's voice saying to him, "Who are you?" Then Grid said in surprise, "Oh, there is someone here." Rising from his bed to see the visitor, the blacksmith of the smithy asked Grid why he had come here. Hearing the question from the local blacksmith, Grid said, "I want to craft the most marketable item. Can you help me with that?" The blacksmith just laughed at his request. The next moment, the blacksmith of the room looked up and said disappointedly, "Marrow sells things in bulk for a lower price, so there hasn't been anything for sale here for a long time." Immediately after these words, the blacksmith of this building said, "I've been closed for a long time, if anything," and Grid exclaimed in surprise. After he found out that there was no point in staying here, Grid said in frustration in his head how annoying it was, and then said, "Well, is there a smithy in the area?" Before he could finish speaking, the door to the building opened and someone's rough voice came from the yard and said, "Hey old man, how are you?" Looking behind him to find out who had come to the forge, Grid saw 5 men with guns and one of them said, "You haven't made up your mind yet. I told you to give us this building as long as we ask nicely." Hearing the demand from one of the robbers who came to the smithy, Grid said in his head, "This is not a good idea, but it is still problematic." Approaching the blacksmith who was lying in his bed, the man handed him a sales contract and said, "Sign this paper, our kindness has its limits, don't forget that." After looking at the piece of paper and what was written on it, Grid mentally said the contract transferred all rights to this building. If this is Marrow's company, it is very influential. Realizing that he had nothing else to do here, Grid quietly headed for the exit and thought, "I don't know what exactly is going on here, but I need to find out as much as possible before a fight breaks out." Noticing the guy who tried to sneak past him, the angry soldier said to Grid, "Hey, did you see the contract? Where are you going? You rascal, you're a scanner spy." Hearing what had just been said to him, Grid said in his head that this gangster was definitely hired by Miro's company, NPCs. Lawless people sometimes kill players. Immediately after this incident, Grid looked around at all the enemies in the room and thoughtfully said in his head, "It seems that these guys are about level 35, so don't fight back yet, just act natural." Throwing his hand behind his head, Grid awkwardly said, "Actually, no, I'm not from around here. I came here not knowing that the forge was closed." And the bandit replied, "I can tell by your looks," and quickly stormed out. Picking up the contract, which offered him 20,000 gold pieces for the building, the blacksmith said insultingly, "You damn criminals want to destroy the family business that has passed through 7 generations." Hearing his grandfather speak to his leader, one of the bandits angrily said, "Watch what you say. You know what we went through because of you, and as a reward, you will pay us half the amount stated in the contract." Hearing the demands of one of the gangsters who came to buy the building, Grid said in surprise in his head, "But he hadn't even had time to agree to your offer yet." Immediately afterwards, another of the bandits decided to provoke the blacksmith by saying, "Didn't your only son die of a disease? So stop insisting that this is his grave." Trying to leave the building, Grid suddenly heard the blacksmith's angry voice exclaiming, "How dare you say such things about my son with your filthy mouth?" Trying to ignore what was happening behind him, Grid said in his head, "Calm down, you're not a hero. Just go away. It's none of your business." Just as he was about to cross the threshold, he felt an effect and saw a system notification in front of him, which said that the task of the blacksmith's rage had been created. Looking down, the boy saw the blacksmith's rage get rid of Mero's jesters and break the contract to sell the forge reward for completion. Increase Khan's resistance to alcohol, favor Khan reward for accepting the task skill. Blacksmith's rage will be activated task failure. In a few days, Khan will die. All tasks related to him will disappear. Seeing this, Grid was surprised to hear what kind of task at such a moment reward for acceptance. Looking at the skill that is activated when he accepts the task, Grid thoughtfully said in his head that it is a class skill. Of course, I have to complete it. What are my chances? Looking at the description of the skill that he activates, the boy noticed in the description of the patience of the legendary blacksmith, "Your health, defense, and dexterity will increase by 1 hour." Then the boy said, "Well, first of all, I have a reliable skill of patience of the legendary blacksmith." Immediately after that, recalling his battle with Doran against Jura, Grid also added in his head that if my health level drops to 1, a passive skill will be activated that makes me invulnerable for 5 seconds. My characteristics are like those of level players. Thinking about what he should do in this situation, Grid nervously said in his head, "The only problem is that I left my equipment in the vault and was left without weapons." The next moment, remembering the 1 arrow he had left, Grid took it out of his inventory and mentally said, "Wait, but I have it, and it's an epic level arrow." Picking up Jaffa's special arrow, Grid mentally said, "Although it has quite a bit of damage, it can still work if you ignore the defense completely." The next moment, the bandits heard from behind them, "Hey, watch your words when you talk to your elders." And the gang leader looked back and said in surprise what you just said. Hearing that the others decided to stand up for him, Khan said in surprise that but why did you suddenly decide to stand up for me?" Looking at the non-local who was still standing in the forge building, the gang leader angrily asked why you were still here, and Grid pointed an arrow at him and said, "There is a limit to everything, even if you are a collector." The next moment, the gang members looked back at Grid and began to shout menacingly that you had just told the scoundrel that we left you alive, you madman, and that you were going to do 1 arrow, so just shut up and disappear. Hearing these words from his enemies, Grid confidently said, "That's not all I have in store. I just got another weapon." After accepting the task of helping the blacksmith, Grid received a system notification that said, "You have received the blacksmith's rage skill plus to attack power and plus to attack speed for seconds recharge seconds after that." He confidently exclaimed, "Don't be a scoundrel." Without even warning, one of the bandits immediately attacked Grid to teach him a lesson for those words. But even from this sudden attack, Grid managed to dodge. Trying to break the distance with the leader of the bandits who attacked him, Grid nervously thought, how did low-level warriors become so fast that I have the advantage? Noticing a great place to continue the battle, Grid headed for the second floor and said in his head, I need to get to the narrow staircase. Having reached the stairs, Grid shouted menacingly, well, attack one by one, whose eye I want to gouge out first. As he approached the brazen man they had given a chance to save his life, one of the bandits, approaching Grid with an axe, angrily shouted, you fucking brat. When he got close enough to Grid, one of the enemies rushed at him and swung his axe, shouting, what can you do with that arrow of yours? Preparing to strike back at the enemy who opened up for the attack, Grid confidently shouted out, preparing to hit the arrow with the fury of the blacksmith. After hitting the enemy, Grid's attack was critical and caused additional damage to the enemy. Seeing what had just happened to their comrade right before their eyes, the bandit leader nervously shouted out what had just happened. Lying on the ground without the ability to get up, one of the defeated bandits said in a hoarse voice that an ordinary arrow was not a weapon at all. Taking a fighting stance and getting ready to fight, Grid confidently shouted out to yours truly, this is an ordinary arrow, so come on, open your eyes. Raising an epic quality arrow above him, Grid saw a system notification and a timer in front of him, which said the skill Blacksmith's Fury was activated. The speed and strength of the attack increased by seconds. Holding the arrow in his hands, thanks to which he defeated one of the enemies, Grid mentally said amazingly, thanks to the increase in attack speed, I can hit twice as fast, because I also pierced with a critical hit and managed to deal with everything in just a few blows. Immediately afterwards, Grid received a system notification saying that you have killed a bandit from Winston. Your reputation in Winston has increased to now you are the enemy of all bandits from Winston, and you have gained experience points. Immediately after that, another system notification came saying that you had raised your level to level 8. Looking at his updated stats, Grid said in amazement in his head, I gained 5 levels for killing a level. My stats increased too. Looking at the enemies approaching him, Grid thoughtfully said, these guys have high attack power and weak defense, so to defeat the rest of them I need to invest points in strength and agility. After analyzing the battlefield, Grid mentally said, there are 4 of them left, so I'll have to use everything I have now. And then he used all his characteristic points and received a system notification saying, you have invested points in strength. You have invested points in agility. The next moment, another enemy rushed at Grid and tried to kill him. Having dodged the enemy's attack, Grid prepared for a counterattack. As he continued to fight, he received a system notification that said there were 10 seconds left in the blacksmith's rage, so he mentally said, I must kill all the remaining enemies in this time. Grasping the arrow tightly in his hands, Grid struck at the enemy, trying to pierce the armor and take him out with one critical hit. After a failed attempt to finish off another enemy, Grid simply threw the enemy back at the other bandits, catching his comrade. One of the enemies said, Preg is fine. Rising to his feet after the missed blow from the guy, the bandit said unhappily, oh shit, I'm not gonna die here. Looks like he was just lucky. Looking at the guy they had to confront, the enemy leader said nervously, but his attacks are too fast. We can't fight with big weapons on narrow stairs. Looking at the enemies who were still there even after the successful attack, Grid said in his head, even after upgrading my stats, I still can't kill them. I'm still too weak now that I'm on recharge. I won't be able to make a critical strike. As the bandits continued to look at each other, the leader of the bandits called out to Grid, hey you, if you don't want to die, you better just give up. Coming down the stairs, Grid mentally said, I have no choice. I have to fight them right away. And immediately after these thoughts, the boy heard the bandit leader say, even if you resist, it won't change anything. Looking at the 4 enemies, Grid mentally said, if they can surround me, I will most likely die from 2 or 3 blows, but I have a backup plan. Moving inside the enemies, Grid mentally added to my health and defense, which was now at 0. But if they surrounded me, I could kill them all. Thinking about his cunning plan, Grid mentally added, until then, All I need to do is keep an eye on my health bar. Recalling the skill he had acquired, namely the legendary Blacksmith stamina, which increased health, defense, and agility for an hour, Grid confidently recited the skill in his head. Noticing that the leader of the bandit gang had come out to them, he happily said, "Thank you for saving our time. I will pay you back in full for killing my friend."